Our next speaker is one of my favorite people who works at Consensus. He is so kind and amazing. He started Infura. Infura was the first RPC provider ever. It was by itself in the beginning, and now, of course, there's so many others out there. But EG Galano, hi. And he's going to be talking about decentralizing Infura.
All right, let's do it. Hi, everybody. I'm EG. Like Susie was saying, I work on Infura. I've worked on Infura for 8 years now. But for the last 2 years, I've been focused on our decentralized product, which is called DIN, Decentralized Infrastructure Network. And so that's what I'm going to give you a little overview on, like what it is, what you can do with it right now, and what the future plans are. So to start, whenever I'm explaining what DIN is and why Infura is doing it, I start with the analogy of business models and how successful business models need to iterate and change over time. Where text messaging in this kind of format here is how we used to interact with text messaging and service providers 20 years ago, where you actually had to think about how many text messages you were using, how you consume your minutes. These days, we don't even think about that. It's not that things got cheaper. It's not that they don't charge for text messaging anymore, but it's priced differently. Sometimes it's just implicit in an overall package that you have. That's one example of how infrastructure services that at one point made sense needed to evolve as the consumption model changed, as a product and an ecosystem matured, and the industry just needs to evolve with it. And so for us, DIN is how we see infrastructure, RPC and API infrastructure for Web3 evolving. DIN is not decentralized RPC alone. Like sometimes I say decentralized RPC just for simplicity so that people understand, okay, this is an API service I can interact with that's not just a single provider hosting the infrastructure anymore. But that's just one use case of what we're trying to do with DIN. We see DIN as a permissionless marketplace where when you think of, as a developer, all of the different tools and APIs that you might be using to build your dApp, that it's kind of a fragmented experience right now where you might come to Infura for certain chains that you want supported. Maybe we don't support other ones, and so you go to another provider. Then maybe you also use some other like indexed APIs and things and go to some other centralized provider to get access to those APIs. It's kind of like a Web 2 development experience when you're trying to build for Web 3. So that's also part of what our thinking was with DIN, is what's like a Web 3 native experience for how you should be finding and consuming these types of services. And so I can get into a bit about like how we envision that working with DIN. There's a couple of different entities on the network. At a high level, customers are always interacting with what we call a gateway. So Infura is a gateway for Web 3. When you first started in Bitcoin and Ethereum back in the day, everybody had to run the piece of software called a node so that you could connect to the peer-to-peer network, get the data, and send transactions. In 2016, we started Infura, helped power MetaMask, and that was one of the first times that people didn't have to do that step anymore. You could just install a wallet, use an application, and somebody else was running the infrastructure for that. So that's what a Web3 gateway is. Infura is one example of that. Behind that are node providers or infrastructure providers, where Infura happens to do both of those things. We're like the gateway that people interact with, and we run the node infrastructure for a bunch of different chains that you might use. We also need to be able to accept payment for those services. For a long time, Infura was free, and then we rolled out our like premium, like paid offering as a traditional SaaS, and that's one of the things that kind of changes in this model with DIN. And then there needs to be something that verifies like an SLA for this network, something that makes sure that with a traditional SaaS service, you get an SLA from us as part of like the contract and the agreement. If we're building this as a decentralized network, how do you get that? The traditional watchtower model with layer 2s is applicable to this because you have an API endpoint that can be checked with health checks, validation tests, consistency tests, and other mechanisms to ensure and grade an endpoint on a specific score of quality of service. So this is another view of like that overview of different actors on the network. Like I mentioned, Infura is down here in like the bottom right as a network operator. We're somebody that's running node infrastructure and offering it to other people as an API service. In front of that, you have these routers or gateways. So there's this DIN router that's currently live on that left-hand side, and that's what people can send traffic to. The first network to go live with for that was Blast, and soon we're also adding Linea as another network. We have 3 or 4 other networks that are now integrated in there, and one of the benefits is a lot of developers were not just using Infura anymore. Now that there are so many other infrastructure providers, there's no reason to just rely on one entity to service your infrastructure needs. So people end up having to have like 3 or 4 different API keys and subscriptions to different centralized service providers to get the resiliency of, well, I can get data from Infura, or if there's an incident or any kind of issue, my requests can get routed to somebody else. This DIN router kind of handles that for you because we've gone out and partnered with several like highly proficient infrastructure operators for the first networks that we've added on DIN. This is a phase that we're calling the federated phase of the network. It's not like a permissionless thing that anybody can download software for and just be a part of the network right now. We have a live service, which is the Infura API that everybody knows, that we need to gradually migrate over to being like a fully permissionless, decentralized version of it. And so that's how we're going about it, is incrementally. So in this step here, we're taking partners, running these tests against their endpoints to see who's pretty proficient at what they do, like what their performance is, and evaluating them and then integrating them into this router based on the needs of, right now, the Infura team and other teams within Consensus that utilize these networks for getting their data. I just went over this network operator role, which is the node operator. These network watchers are the ones that I mentioned, which run a suite of tests. So if you created a new layer 2, maybe similar to the Blast network, there's some new API methods that you needed to add to support new functionality on your chain. The only way that that can be validated so that people can actually use it on this network is if these network watchers have a specification that they can test against. So like I said earlier, DIN is a marketplace that we want anybody to be able to offer services on. So at some point, somebody needs to define what that service is and how to test it. And these watchers are the things that actually test it. They test it based on the information that's in this on-chain node registry. So you can think of this as typical like service discovery in application development, but it's on-chain. And there's a way to say like, give me, optimistic roll-up services corresponding to like that support these types of functionality, or are deployed in these regions and meet this like performance criteria, and then be able to filter the services that come back from that to decide how your traffic gets routed. These ingress operators are the gateways that I'm referring to. Our first one that we have live is the one that we as the DIN team run, the DIN router. But the goal is that we start with this one because it's easier to coordinate in this first phase of the network. And then over time, we're going to add more gateways. So it's not just one endpoint that you can go to get access into the network. You can run your own gateway if you're somebody that's already somebody with like a developer customer base, like maybe ThirdWeb or Covalent that was just up here talking, would be a good example of somebody that might decide to be an ingress operator for the network. Like I mentioned, Linea is the next network that we're adding, and that process looks like we have to create the service definition of what it means to be a Linea node operator. It's pretty much the EVM RPC API, but we get to define like the performance criteria that they need to meet for that, make decisions on like where that infrastructure needs to be deployed geographically, and then select the best infrastructure providers to integrate into DIN. We consider DIN like a case study in decentralization, taking a traditional centralized product in Infura and then figuring out the way to transition it over to being decentralized and more resilient. And one of the benefits of that is other products within Consensus that utilize Infura, like MetaMask, like Linea, other internal teams within Consensus can benefit from that resiliency and improved decentralization that DIN provides without having to do the work themselves because they were already utilizing Infura. We got here by understanding that this was a problem that we needed to solve, that we didn't want MetaMask in particular and other products within the company to solely be relying on the Infura team for this like critical infrastructure dependency. And then also it was becoming pretty challenging for us to keep up with the ever-growing like number of networks that we needed to support. Pretty much every week somebody new was coming to us and asking us to support a new layer 2 or maybe even a new layer 1. And that amount of like complexity and cost would grow linearly over time. And there was no like economies of scale. It was pretty challenging for us to keep up with. So making this into a decentralized network, a permissionless marketplace that other people can participate in seemed like the best way for us to get access to these other networks without always being the ones on the hook for running the infrastructure. Oh, all right, no worries. Where we're at today is I mentioned that we're in this federated phase. We're developing different components that will eventually become open source components that other people can run to participate in this network. And in this federated phase, there's no like on-chain payments. Right now, we're the ones that are coordinating payments, but the goal is to transition that into an on-chain payment system like later this summer, hopefully, and we'll be able to set the parameters of that based on the learnings over the last 6 months since our network first went live. Since I'm running out of time, I'll focus on the most important thing, which is what we're doing here is talking about Linea, and the way that we're implementing this first version of payments for DIN is through essentially a layer 3 on top of Linea. So we have this payment channel implementation that's pretty much as a consumer of this network, you're going to be able to set up a payment channel with the infrastructure providers that are serving your requests, whether it's for network A, B, C, or D, whatever it is. The service providers get to define how they accept payment. This isn't just like a single type of token used for payment on the network. It's a marketplace where if you're the one that's creating a new chain, you get to decide how much it costs, what type of token is used for payment, and offer it on this marketplace. And then infrastructure providers can choose to serve that, and then users can discover that and consume the services, going to one place to get hopefully all of their infrastructure dependency needs met. So I'll wrap it there. I'll be around here in case you want to ask any other questions. Otherwise, thank you very much.
If you were